Welcome to another episode of the Heritage Buildings Podcast. I'm Vincent Reed, your host, and I'm really thrilled today to be joined by my friend and colleague, Andrew Holloway. Andrew is a pioneer in timber conservation, sustainable building and craftsmanship. Andrew is a renowned conservation carpenter and the founder and former managing director of the Green Oak Carpentry Company. Under his leadership, the company became a trailblazer in designing traditional and modern timber structures, restoring historic buildings and collaborating with organisations like the National Trust, English Heritage and the Crown Estate. Some of Andrew's most celebrated projects include the Wealden Downland Museum Gridshell, the Savill Gardens Grid Shell and numerous award-winning timber structures. Now, beyond Andrew's remarkable career, he has dedicated himself to education and philanthropy, serving as a tutor, author and advocate for sustainable building practices. So, Andrew, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Vincent. That's very kind of you to say that.
Not at all. I've been really looking forward to this because we met on the trip in Ethiopia.
We
and
did.
I absolutely loved talking to you. I remember on a minibus once we talked for hours and it was a really memorable moment for me talking to you. And we just chatted for hours. And then I also remember we were at a conference in Bilbao, Icamos conference.
Oh, yeah.
And you and I went off to that tapas bar and had this amazing Spanish wine. And we spent about 3 hours in this tapas bar.
I remember.
Yeah.
Great fun.
Yeah, no, so yeah, very fond memories. So I really want to know how it all started, right at the beginning, and if you can tell the audience, that'd be great.
Well, yes. I started out life as a potter and did an apprenticeship with A. Harris and Sons, who were manufacturers of beautiful English terracotta pottery, big Alibaba jars and rhubarb saucers and strawberry barrels and all those wonderful things, and did a year's apprenticeship for the princely sum of £14, 12 shillings and sixpence a week. It wasn't, believe you me, it wasn't much then. And did that for a year and then left and did a ceramics degree at Farnham Art College. Farnham just happened to be my local college. What I didn't realise until a little later on was that Farnham was probably among the best craft-based colleges anywhere in the country, up there with the Royal and Corsham and a number of others. Did that for 4 years and then set up my studio as a potter, which I then ran for about 5 or 6 years, making wood-fired stoneware, fairly high temperature stuff, 1300 centigrade, some decorative, some functional, some utilitarian, oven to tableware, and so on, and really enjoyed the chemistry and the whole elemental nature of ceramics. But after probably about 3 years, it was still fun, but it wasn't fulfilling as it had been. I was beginning to one of my tutors said to me once, it takes 7 years to establish a studio, whether it's pottery or carpentry or whatever it is. And I think that's probably right. I think you evolve into what you're doing. And at the end of 3 years, I was beginning to understand how to fire the kiln, how to really make good pottery, how to look at what I was making and be critical, how to make glazes that fitted the clay body. And I was developing a range of glazes based in wood ashes. So when the gardener at the estate where we were potting pruned the pear trees or the cherry trees or the apple trees or whatever, I would burn all the prunings and turn them into ash which I would then slake and sieve and use as a glaze ingredient,
Wow.
because wood ash is a remarkable and complex chemical substance with very microfine silica and fluxes and metallic oxides and all sorts of things that bring great beauty to a glaze. But it wasn't enough. It didn't satisfy me. And I then started the journey of, well, what is the next step? And I always had a woodworking bench in my pottery studio, because when you're trying to survive as a potter, you tend to do everything. So
That's what I was thinking. Were you surviving? How did you make a living as a potter? That must have been incredibly difficult.
it was enormously difficult. And I remember, my young family, my wife and the one child back then, we had two, living very hand to mouth. And we had a small holding. And I remember that one day the taxman wrote to us and said, "I don't believe you can make a living for your declared income. Please have your books ready for inspection on such and such a date." And of course, we were greatly perturbed by this. And I remember talking to my Chinese business partner who'd helped us set up the pottery, and said, "What are we going to do? I don't want to be hauled over the coals and taxed or whatever." He said, "You're fine, absolutely fine." He said, "Take them to the house and make them a cup of tea and show them the ducks and the geese and the vegetable garden, and you'll understand." So that's what we did. And the taxman looked at all of this, and he was very smart in a suit, walking through all the chicken manure and goat poo and whatnot. And he looked at me, and after looking at the books and getting the lay of the land, he apologized for troubling us and said, "I quite understand, and I won't be back. I'm perfectly satisfied that you are living, subsisting." And that was it.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Is that a tip for anybody who's going to possibly get
Yeah, absolutely. Show them your
visited
livestock.
by the taxman?
Yes. Yeah. So anyway, that came to an end when I made the decision to sell up, and I put everything on the market. Back then, of course, you advertised in the Craftsman Potters Association magazine, and it was like bees around a honeypot. I built this kiln. Someone came and dismantled it, numbered all the bricks, and carefully dismantled it. And my glazed materials, I had quite a considerable collection of different types of chemical compounds and oxides, which I used for my glaze formulations, and my power wheel, my pug mill, all of the equipment sold.
Were you quite sad though to let it go?
No. No, I wasn't.
Interesting.
No. I've been sad about it subsequently, because I get these little moments of nostalgia.
Yeah.
But at that time, I had a love-hate relationship with ceramics. And I was a very harsh critic of what I was doing, too harsh. And I actually subsequently wished that I'd kept a little bit more of the pottery I made. And I have a few pieces that are left. And every now and once in a while, I pick them up and think, well, that was that. I did have an eye. I did look. I did make beautifully well thought through, beautifully crafted pieces, but wasn't able to appreciate it at the time. So I one day shut up shop, advertised everything, sold everything, shut up shop and walked out of the door, closed it knowing that I was never going back, and went home and was making a cup of tea when the phone rang. And a friend of mine said, Andrew, I hear you're doing carpentry now. Would you like to come and rebuild my greenhouse? So I said, yes, very much. When do you want me to start? And she said, well, you can come over tomorrow. And I was already signed up for a City and Guilds course in carpentry and joinery starting in October, whenever it was.
And you had a family by then, and you had children.
Yeah, we had children, yeah.
Yeah, but you didn't really have anything substantial to go to.
No, wow. No. It was a year when I was not going to be able to earn very much. My wife Stephanie had some savings from previous, work that she'd done in publishing in London, and so we lived a very hand-to-mouth existence for a year. However, what was very rewarding was that once I'd got I always had reasonably good skills, but lacked any kind of knowledge. And so after I'd done my City and Guilds, which was an intensive 1-year-long course, I'd acquired a lot of tools. And we did joinery, we did form work, we did carcassing, kitchen, fitted work, first fix, second fix. So it was very broad. And I finished that the following year, and a good friend of mine actually phoned me up and said, Andrew, I've decided to do a bit of property developing. I bought an old mill near Midhurst. Would you come and be my carpenter and help, rebuild and refurbish everything, which I did. And it was an enormously challenging project, but a lot of fun. But it wasn't big structural scale carpentry. And it was that I kind of realized I wanted to get involved in. And it wasn't until one day a friend of mine, I clearly expressed this sort of direction of travel to my friends and colleagues. And one day a friend said to me, we've got two friends who own a house in Emsworth, and they need some repair work done. Would you be interested? And of course, I jumped at the opportunity, even though I was, terribly underqualified to undertake structural repairs on a timber frame. So I went down there, and there was this beautiful jetted townhouse, 17th century townhouse in Emsworth, and one of the panels in the master bedroom had fallen out, and the couple had found themselves staring at the night sky in the early hours of the morning. And they said to me, we need someone who can start right away. Can you look at this for us? And so I said, yes, I obviously need to get timber on order, and we agreed a day rate. And I prepared a cutting list and went to my local sawmills, which was Lily White's in Singleton. Don't know if they're still going, and bought all the timber. And I can truthfully say that was probably one of the scariest things I've ever done, because every day driving to work, I was scolding myself for having been so foolish as to bite off more than I could chew. But I got through it, and the clients were very happy with the work, and I was very happy with the work, and I, worked out how to do slip tenons, and when you've got a captive frame member that you can't enter the joint at both ends, as it were. So, and we did the panels, and I did lime rendered panels, knocked up all the lime myself, and finished the building. And one day I was doing the finishing touches, and a white van drove past, and a couple of quite hippie-ish looking guys got out and said to me, "Oh, So you're doing that job, are you? Well, we priced that a year ago, but decided it was a bit iffy, a bit too difficult for us, so we didn't proceed with it.
Hmm.
And but we're doing an oak frame, um, and for a private client in Harting. Would you like to come and join us? And of course, I said yes. And in a couple of weeks' time, I started work. What I didn't realize was that I had probably just encountered two of the most experienced of the carpenters who were at the forefront of the revival of
Oh,
traditional oak frame, timber frame carpentry. They'd both trained in Paris with the Compagnon du Devoir and had, I don't know how long they'd worked there, maybe a couple of years or so, um, and had returned back to the UK and were looking to practice and find clients to build beautiful traditional oak frame buildings for. And they'd rather landed on their feet because they encountered um, um, this London lawyer who Rupert Gray, who was engaged them to build a barn as a library, and they lit upon the idea of doing a traditional 3-bay crown post roof structure, beautifully considered and drawn and detailed. Paul was quite an artist on the drawing board as well as a good carpenter. John was a structural engineer who jumped ship and decided that he had had enough of the cut and thrust of being a structural engineer in Portsmouth. So they were very capable, able individuals. And we first job was to build the framing floor. So we leveled a piece of ground. We had some marine ply or exterior quality ply. We put down timber grounds and we screwed together this framing floor. And then what followed over the next 4 or 5 months was, in effect, a masterclass in the skills of timber framing.
mm.
We were lofting, we were scribing, we were.
What does lofting mean? What's
lofting?
lofting?
Is basically drawing the frame full size on the floor. So your floor is a giant drawing board, and you
I see.
draw a 1:1 scale drawing of your oak frame, and you use trigonometry to get it perfectly square and precise. You can be accurate to within, a few millimeters, 2 or 3 millimeters, quite easily. And clients would sometimes say to me, "Your frame's wrong, Andrew. It doesn't fit." And I'd go, "Check the groundworks. It'll almost certainly be that." Because we were working with this system of lofting that was incredibly precise. And we developed systems for checking and double checking. And we always knew which was the face side of the line, which side of the line we were putting our main post or our sill plate or our top plate. There were very, well-established conventions for every single step along the way. So we were lofting, we were scribing using a plumb bob. We were using the plumb bob to mark angled intersections, things like braces and dragon ties and so on, so that the joint could be precise and cut accurately first time around. That was the trick of it, was that you were trying to mark out a joint, cut it, and drill the hole through the mortise so that when you entered the tenon, the shoulder was accurate and you could spot the peg hole on the tenon do the offset, and then the next time that frame went back together, everything was ready to drive in the steel framing pins, and it was precise and accurate. And
when you say, sorry to interrupt, Andrew, when you say scribing, are you meaning scribing the joints? Yeah.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
And then, of course, using plumb and level marks so that those components in the frame that went into 2 layups would go in plumb in one orientation, level in the next, or vice versa. And that meant that these three-dimensional joints were accurate, and the frame would go together three-dimensionally for the first and only time, when it was assembled on site. So some weeks later or months later, we did a lot of carving and embellishment, and it was really an extraordinary frame. And crown post roofs are medieval. They stopped making crown post roof frames probably around about 1550. I think that carpenters discovered that there were better ways of doing it, and that A, they were a bit labor intensive, and B, actually structurally they weren't particularly good. And that side class purlins, well, butt purlins were actually much better. So it fell out of favor, but it's a very attractive truss type, because you've got a crown purlin which runs down the center line of the building, and you've got up braces from the crown post that go to the crown purlin, and down braces that go to the tie beam. So you get this lovely tree-like effect. And we did, subsequently to that, we did a job for the Chithurst Buddhist monastery near Midhurst. And the monks were proponents of a Thai Buddhist forest order. And of course, when they saw the crown post roof, they immediately said, yes, that's what we want. That's the type of truss that's most redolent of the forest, which is where we find our roots as Buddhists. So they commissioned a crown post roof frame. So yes, that was the first frame we did, and I remember the client was absolutely tickled pink, and he'd come home every day from the city, and when we started putting the frame together, he would, he became sort of rather enthusiastic and opened a couple of Jeroboams of champagne and put on Verdi's Requiem Mass full volume. It boomed down the valley, and we had to stop work at that point. But it was great. Funny. He was a great client. And
so at this stage, there was 3 of you, and were you working on a day rate for them, or was it an equal share? Was it their company?
No, it was their business really, and I was very much the new kid on the block, and sitting at their feet and learning, which I was very happy to do.
How old were you then, do you think?
Gosh, 28 maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. But they lived a very different lifestyle to me. I was beginning to enjoy a more secure lifestyle, and with wife and kids, and neither of which they had. They were much more sort of happy-go-lucky, and if the job came along sometime, that was fine.
Yeah.
They didn't need to pay rent on the house, or didn't have much in the way of bills to pay. So after a while, we agreed to part company, and I started making kitchens because there was a huge amount of demand for that. And Johnny Gray was Rupert Gray's brother, and he commissioned me to do some kitchens, and he was quite a well-known kitchen designer. He might have been one of the originators of, in fact, he was one of the originators of the unfitted kitchen, which was the idea that your kitchen could actually travel with you, and that you'd have a lot of units that, you know, you could simply lift up and remove. And he was a really first-class designer. So I worked for him for a bit, but I always wanted to do the framing. So, but finding yourself the clients who are willing to spend £40,000 maybe on a big oak framed house, as it would have been back then, 40, 45, was a difficult thing to achieve. And
yeah, I imagine.
Yeah, I recall the first major commission I got was for a property in Cranley called Horseblock Hollow for a client called Mr. Jim Woof. And I built him this big house. And I can remember, and of course it was down to me, everything was down to me as to whether it went together or not. And as I've already said, you know, oak framing is modular prefabricated system of carpentry. And you don't know how well you have done your work until that frame goes together.
Yeah.
And that is, you know, the only three-dimensional assembly that takes place, and that's what actually happens for real. So I remember completing the assembly with a big 30-ton truck crane and a couple of mates to help me, and being absolutely ecstatic with the way it had gone together, and feeling really happy that I had, or shown to myself as much as anything, that I could do that carpentry work. And, you know, there was a background level of anxiety, you know, on the first solo project until it had actually gone up. So that was a great moment.
Amazing. And what was that going to be? What building was?
It was a house.
It was a house.
Yeah,
so it was quite sizable then.
It was a very generous, big 4-bedroom house with arcaded doors and a jetty, and all the floor joisting. Had dragon beams. The client wanted, you know, to push the boat out. So it was definitely carpentry in service of beauty and an arts and crafts style house, you know, with obviously with looking at historical precedents and learning the lessons. But
and who was helping you? Who, did you have a small team by then, or was?
Not really. I was doing most of it solo. I had, like, as I'd learnt with John Russell and Paul Russell and John Winterbottom, I set up a framing floor outside, and I put down the timber grounds and plywood, painted it white, and it was al fresco framing, which meant that there were hazards. And during a particularly heavy downpour, part of my framing floor sank, and I had to remove all the wall frame I was working on and reconsolidate the ground underneath, relay the floor, and restart the layout. So,
crikey, there's a cost there.
Yeah, very much so. But it was, but you know, you're a bit more nimble back then when it's just you and a bag of tools. And then the next time I did a frame, I realized I had to employ someone. And so I started out with my first employee, and taught them what I knew, and of course embarked upon that interesting journey that all you know, craftsmen and businessmen travel when you are, you know, teaching, running the business, teaching your apprentice, getting the job out as well as all of that. estimating. The skill sets are, and you've been there yourself, and you know that no one can quite prepare you for, the multitude of skills that you will need to do what you are doing successfully. I often say to my carpenters when I have the opportunity to talk sort of with a beer, that the skill set is actually quite diverse. If you're going to really build beautiful timber structures, you have to be a good communicator. You have to be able to draw well, speak well, and write well. You have to be able to estimate. You have to be able to do, at least the basic spreadsheets. And you have to be able to design so that, when you sit down and you do the drawings, and I, of course, early days, I did all my own drawings. You have to build in that beauty into the structure with proportion, with light and shade, with understanding the weight that carpenters would have attributed to different sections and of timber within the building. Some can be light, some need to be a bit heavier. And then how the carpenters thought about their ornamentation and why. And, understanding that sometimes less is more when you are embellishing a structural frame. Yeah, and just really began that journey of becoming an employer and a businessman and a craftsman and a designer and a communicator, essentially.
And is this it's the mid 80s, late 80s? Around that time?
Mid late 80s, yeah. Yeah.
And did you find that you had many competitors? Was it quite rare for people to be doing that? Because that, in some respects, was to some people quite old-fashioned. And why would you want to do that when you can put buildings up much quicker?
Well, that's a very good question, actually, because you're quite right. Back then, timber framing was voodoo, and I was competing with, and you'll know these names: Peter McCurdy, Charlie Brentnell, Rupert Newman, and but we were a fairly small group, adventuring into this revival. Perhaps you might argue that the craft skills had always existed, but they'd sort of all but died out. There were a few, individuals who perhaps knew how to do oak framing, timber framing correctly, and in fact, it was those were the sort of the heyday, if you like, of historic carpentry, because you were one of a very small community. Your order book was always bursting at the seams. I mean, once I got established by 93, 4, 5, I had a full order book most of the time, and it was very unusual to have a gap in the work, and in fact, sometimes quite welcome to have a gap.
And you happen to be in quite a wealthy area as well. That was
absolutely
it would have been different if you were somewhere else in the country that wasn't so affluent as the Midhurst area.
Yeah, absolutely. Being south central England, was a great boon. We picked up orders from the wealthy house builders, and that began to get established doing slightly bigger structures, church halls, school halls, the Buddhist meditation hall that I mentioned, the Dharma hall for the Chithurst Buddhist community, and so on. And I remember that there are a few projects that stand out for various reasons. And one of them was a bridge that we did. It was the first bridge structure, and there's always something rather special about bridges, about spanning across in the case of this bridge, 18 meters across the Grand Union Canal. And I remember the discussions with Ealing Borough Council saying to me, how concerned should we be about fire? How concerned should we be about, the longevity of the structure and so on? And they were all good questions, and they're all questions that needed, appropriate answers. And we got through that, and they were reasonably happy that we could build this bridge that was in effect a 3-pin arch, spanning the Grand Union Canal at Greenford. And so we prepared drawings. Back then, I had just started employing someone as an architect. I guess we were up to a team of 7 or 8 carpenters and 3 or 4 office-based staff.
Okay.
And we'd been joined by an architect who was exceptionally able. So we started producing CAD drawings and very nice 3D visualizations and so on. And I remember the client turned around to me. We had almost finished the design, and we had ordered the timber. And he said to me, "Andrew, we've dropped a ball. I don't know whether our structure is DDA compliant." And it wasn't. So at the very 11th hour, we had to reduce the span to rise ratio of the bridge quite substantially. So you can imagine you've got a 3-pin arch, and you do that, you very quickly get to a critical point where, it's not a stable structure. So at that point, I introduced a tie rod, and we went to Macalloy and procured this 32 millimeter diameter tie rod, and then we had to redesign the structure because we needed the attachments at the foot of the main carriage beams of the structure. And we also realized that the longitudinal shrinkage of the beam, although very low, was a significant factor over 18 meters. And it actually meant that the crown of the bridge would fall by as much as 6 inches. So that's worked out on the basis of the Trada figure for long range shrinkage of 0.1%. So I went back, and we obviously agreed at additional costs, and we introduced this tie rod, and it had an adjuster in the middle that Macalloy had designed a hydraulic device that would actually, if necessary, you could pull in the tie rod and tighten it and keep on tensioning the bridge, and actually, if anything, shortening the tie rod by enough that the crown of the bridge would go back up. And so we introduced that whole technology into the bridge so that it could be adjusted. And the interesting thing about it was that we cut datums on the central posts, which had a nice green man carving on, facing out into the canal. And we cut on the datums, and we went back some years later, 5 years after, and monitored the shrinkage of the bridge. Actually, we went back after about a year, and then again at 2, and so on. But after about 5 years, the shrinkage of the structure was stabilizing, and we could measure what the drop had been. And actually, it was much less, because we were procuring beautiful straight grain timber. I think the shrinkage was probably about 0.05%, not 0.1%. So yeah, and I remember, we had this most enormous crane to lift this structure into place. So we had to assemble it on the ground by the site, and then crane the whole thing into place. And we knew that there was a minimum headroom clearance required from the water level of the canal to the underside of the tie bar of 3 meters. And of course, when you're working with lots of moving parts, you've got the groundworker doing the abutments and so on, you're never entirely sure that you've got it as it needs to be. And I remember that we'd just lifted the bridge into place and finished the decking boards, and we were, ready for the canal to open. And of course, being a busy canal, they were keen to open it and get it into use as quickly as possible. And it was about 4:30 in the afternoon, and around the corner came a canal boat with a rather tall gentleman with a hat driving, steering this thing. And as he approached the bridge, I could see that he wasn't quite going to make it. But he just took his hat off at the last minute and put it down beside him, and his tie bar just went over the top. We were just in limit. So yeah.
Oh, how funny. I was just thinking, sort of going back for those early days when there was you and one other, and you're now starting to realize that you have to wear multiple hats.
Yeah.
You have to be client facing, you have to be the estimator, the buyer, the project manager, the designer, everything. Not only that, it must have been so physical and also mentally challenging. So you were hit both ways, with the physical side, the mental side, and then so you must have got home and been in bed by 8 o'clock. I mean, you must have been, even though you were only sort of late 20s. Well, no, now you're around about sort of 30, 31 or so.
Yeah. Early 30s.
Yeah, so you must have been absolutely exhausted. Do you remember that? Do you remember how you felt?
I do remember that. And I do remember that feeling of, I'm not done yet, because there's an estimate I need to get out, because I need the pipeline of work to work. And I've also got my VAT return to do. And I do remember, that feeling of coming back and having put in what most people would consider a pretty full day, and then still having to do more. So yes, the evenings and the weekends were often taken up doing those jobs that meant that you had continuity of work and the right kind of work as well. Because very quickly you establish yourself as a safe pair of hands producing a timber structure. And yes, of course, you're happy to do the bread and butter, but you're also keeping your eye on the really exciting projects that come along, once in a while. And which I suppose is the opportunity for us to talk about the Downland Grid Shell. And the transferability of the skill set of being a conservator and a carpenter of, heavy oak frame structures. And I can remember, because we had a good relationship with the Wealden Downland Open Air Museum. I mean, I'd worked for a part of, in the early days, with Roger Champion on a couple of projects, Longport and Soul Street.
And Roger was one of the founders, wasn't he?
Roger wasn't a founder. He was one of the most experienced, long-standing carpenters.
Okay.
And if you walk around the museum, you will see his work everywhere, from the oak frame repair to the furniture, to little small artifacts that he made that went into the houses. He was remarkable, and his skill was truly astounding. And I learnt, chapter and verse of historic building conservation. Of course, the then director was Christopher Zoyner. And Christopher Zoyner was probably one of the more hands-on museum directors. And he would walk around the site at least twice a day and stop and talk to everyone. And I started out I got commissioned to do a picture roof on the cafe building by Sol Street. And it was, not a particularly difficult job, but it was a bastard hip end. And Christopher Zoyner, and it was a frosty morning, and I remember Christopher Zoyner walking up to me and going, "Yep, okay, very good," just going on. But he obviously liked the cut of my jib for whatever reason. And when the decision was made to build a timber grid shell, and Green Oak had already grown and had a reasonable team size.
Yeah, I was going to say it was established now. The Green Oak Company,
Yeah.
was it formed was it 91?
No, I think we incorporated in 93. Up until then, I'd been a sole trader.
Oh, so you're a sole trader up until that point.
Yeah.
And what year was this when you were working at the Wealden Downland on that roof?
I was probably, because I was would have been early, late 80s, early 90s.
Okay.
Yeah, we had a team with an architect and a designer, and a couple of, and also Steve had been working for Green Oak, Steve Corbett, and Steve Corbett was an enormously important part of the business. There's a sense in which I was aware that being good at something is about knowing when you need someone else's expertise. And because of the skill set and the breadth of the skill set that we were just talking about earlier, knowing what you don't know is a great thing, and having enough emotional intelligence to be able to build a team and invite others to join the team and have an offering that might excite others of real ability to join that team was an important part of the journey. And Steve had worked for me in Green Oak as a carpenter, a very good carpenter, and then gone off and done a sabbatical to write a book. Whilst he was doing that, these contract documents arrived on my desk in 98, 99 or something like that. And I remember with some trepidation opening this huge big envelope, drawings, beautifully hand drawn. It was Ted Cullinan, who was the Cullinan Studios, as they are now, who were the architects. Steve Johnson was the contract architect. Richard Harris was not the museum Richard Harris, but the Jura Happold Richard Harris was the senior engineer. And I sat down, and over the next, I think we had about 6 weeks, 2 months to prepare our bids. And my main competitor then was Carpenter Oak. So Charlie, no doubt, was sitting burning the midnight oil, trying to get his bid out as well as everything else.
And this is the grid shell, isn't it?
This is the down the grid shell, yes. And I remember, getting everything together, and we did an exercise where we went to the museum, and we knew where the building was going to go, and we knew that we had a workshop that was going to be adjacent to it, and we knew that we had to walk with 50-meter long oak laths, finger jointed together, what we might call spaghetti timber, from the workshop down the site to the point where we could actually put these huge long laths onto the building. But we had to do it several hundreds of times. And how do you begin to price something like that? So
exactly, I was going to say, how?
Well, we had a stopwatch, and we would walk from A to B and try and imagine how long it was going to take us, because pricing is a bit of a dark art, and I'm sure you're aware. You know, it's this combination of so many different things. You know, how much risk is there on the job? Because you need to price risk, and the riskier a job is, the more you're going to put in to cover those little unforeseen eventualities that you don't want to catch you out. Of course, this was a huge project for us. I mean, we'd worked on some quite big structures, 200, 300, 400,000 pounds, but this was £1 million. This project was worth £1 million of carpentry.
Wow.
And so it was a big step up. And, you know, a few wrong steps and you're not going to be in business for very long. So we were very careful, and I was the estimator, Steve was the technical expertise. And together we put together the documentation and traveled up to London for the interview. And I think we were the last one of the day, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing, but you know, do you interview your number one first? Or anyway, we were traveling home and the phone rang and the architect said, "You've got the job. We want you to come to the pre-start meeting in a week's time and you'll meet the team."
Right.
So,
let's just rewind a bit, because one, how desperate were you to win the work? Did you really want to win it?
oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Now, so that leads me on to my next question. If you wanted to win it that much, did you compromise the price to try and win the work?
No. It's the art of estimating is a little bit like sailing. How close to the wind can you go before you're luffing and you're in irons? You have to, as much as possible, the clarity of the thought that you put into that estimating will determine the safety of your price. But you want to be safe, but you don't want to be too safe. You want to make your margins, whatever that your profit and overhead figure is, but you don't want to be, you want to win. You want to win because clearly it was a lot of time and effort, and so and of course what I didn't say was that when the documents arrived on my desk, I phoned Steve up and I said, "Steve, you finished writing that book?" And he said, "Yeah, okay, yeah, I have." And I said, "Well, do you want to come and have a beer with me one evening and we'll have a look at some drawings?" So we met up in the local pub and I unrolled these big wad of drawings and Steve looked at them. He goes, "Yeah, when can I start?" So there was a serendipitous meeting of abilities and talents that was really significant on that project. But I think you've always got to be wary of being desperate to win something, so I think you have to, if the price isn't right, you walk away. And I remember we priced St. George's Hall for the palace after the fire for Windsor Castle. And there were 4 people pricing, and there was Caps and Caps, myself, Carpenter Oak, and Peter McCurdy. And the interesting thing about that job was that Caps and Caps came in at around about 650,000. Myself, Carpenter Oak, and Peter McCurdy came within a very close bracket of about between 1.1 and 1.2. Now that should have told the estimate, the QS, that the Caps and Caps bid was unsafe. But, and I'm quite cross about this even now, they decided to run with Caps and Caps, and they should never have done it because it was an unsafe bid. And that job put Caps and Caps into receivership. So they managed to get some extra costs, but ultimately, with the recession that came along after, was too long, too harsh, and they went out of business. And we lost a really valuable resource. And, you know, were really good ecclesiastical joiners, but they bought the job, and you should never do that.
No. Did you ever work out before you won the project up to that point, roughly what it cost you in time to work on the price, go to site, do all of your estimate?
Yeah.
Were you considering, okay, look, we're into £2,000 now. Now we're into 4,000. Now we're into 5,000. So, because it's very risky, isn't it? When you put such a lot of time and effort into a big £1 million project that you could
Yes.
lose all of a
Yeah.
sudden, you could be £10,000, £15,000 out of pocket.
Absolutely. It's a really good point, Vincent, because, you know, it is, especially on a project of that size, it's a huge risk. I think the skill is that you have to keep the ship steady. So you're doing your bread and butter work, and you have to treat that and find the time to treat that with as much care as the bigger, more interesting projects. And also, I was very aware that when we took on that job, that it was going to be a year to make it. It was going to take all of a year. We were a year as part of the design team, working with architects and engineers to complete the technical drawings. Exceptionally clever and wise decision on the part of the client, the architect and the engineer, to bring the carpentry team on board early, post planning, but before building control sign off. So we collaborated for a year, and it was a wonderful team. I mean, we brought the complementary skills that came together around that table were exceptional. And the way we worked together was exceptional because there was a lot of mutual respect, and, you know, we understood the difficulty of the engineering and the design and the client's, you know, risks. So all of that went into this big melting pot. And I remember Christopher Zoyner saying to us, there will be no LADs on this project, so no liquidated and ascertained damages for late delivery. And that was a huge step in the right direction. If you want to do something difficult, and it was difficult, then you needed to be able to de-risk it for all of the parties concerned to a point. But whilst we were doing that, I was also spending a lot of time working on the core business and keeping the bread and butter working. I remember very early on, I said to Steve, I will come to site once a day, once a week. I'll be available to go through any problems for that day, but the rest of the time I'll be dipping in and out because I'll be doing the main job. And that was a really important part of keeping the core business thriving. Yeah.
It's amazing. And was there any point when you had that phone call, you've won the work, was there any point where you celebrated and went, yes, and then went, oh shit. what have I done? Why have I opened my big mouth?
What the heck have I gone and done now? It was like, yeah. Oh.
I know, because that's how I felt when I've won really important historic work. You know, you sort of don't really think about the moment when they say, yes, please, can you do it? You don't really think, but there is a moment where I remember coming back once and we won work at Kensington Palace or somewhere, and I walked in and said to my wife, we won the project at the Palace. And she went, yeah, fantastic. This is great. And I'm sort of quite subdued and I'm not celebrating in the same way. She said, you're so miserable. Why are you not? And didn't quite understand the pressure of winning a big project, and then it's your name and you have to deliver it. It's unbelievable pressure.
Yeah. And I think that pressure never really goes away because, you can't really sit on your laurels, so we did, the Ross project for Waddesdon Manor, the reading room, which was a glue lam diagrid structure, extremely taxing. We then went on to do a few years later Savill, and St Edward's School, which was another glue lam, and so on. And you're only, I say it's a bit trite, isn't it? But you're only as good as your last project, and it's not quite true. But I think it's important to know that your reputation is won over time and lost easily if you don't keep doing the work as well as to the best of your ability. And occasionally you do let balls drop and things are not quite as they should be. And at Waddesdon Manor we had problems with procurement of some of the glue lam beams, and we delayed the builder on site, and we had costs awarded against us, and that was financially probably one of the hardest situations we had to live through, because we didn't make any money that year, and of course construction is one of those businesses where if you're not planning for a rainy day, you're not running a tight ship. Because construction is first into a recession, last out. So it's very recession prone. 2008, I don't know how it was for you, Vincent, but we watched our order book shrink as clients realized that their portfolios were no longer worth anything like as much as they had been the week or even the day before. We pulled through, but it was because we'd got a rainy day fund. And I remember saying to my wife, I don't know how much longer we can continue to spend our capital. But yeah, we did. And of course, we were then in a really good position when the recession ended, because we kept all of our core team busy. And we did that because we've always used subcontractors strategically. Over the years, you build up a pool of subcontractors who've worked in the company, who you respect and like and know are highly able. And so when we got work that kept the whole permanent team busy, with probably about 20 or so carpenters, 20 or so staff all told. You then used your subcontractors to absorb what was over and above available to you work-wise over and above that. But then, of course, when the recession comes, they're the first to be shed. But it meant that we could keep our core team busy, which was a huge boon to us. So it was just it just happened to be the strategy that worked very well for us over quite a number of years.
Yeah. And that's good. So you managed to survive because you'd put some away and were being sensible, and so many people didn't, and so many people did go under. I remember having record orders. I think it was about April 2008. We had a record number of orders coming in, and it was just like a tap turning off. Within a week, everything had been cancelled. Incredible. I had to make people redundant, and it was a very, very difficult time. Very, very difficult.
Yeah, no, it was very hard for us as well. We squeaked through. We did get through it, but it was not something I would want to go through again.
Just going back to the Gridshell, did you ever find out why you were awarded the contract? What it was? One particular thing or a couple of things?
Interesting question. We were cheaper, but not a lot. I think we I think that Steve and I presented very well together. Um, Steve has got a very technical brain, um, and I'm a more of a generalist, and I can read the room, which helps hugely. So emotional intelligence is, you know, one of the key qualities of being successful in business, I think.
Mm.
Um, uh, not to underestimate, of course, just sheer dogged persistence and the willingness to put in the hours. Um, so I think we just came across as very competent and able
Yeah.
and interested and with some imagination, and we were coming up with ideas of how to do things, and we'd done a bit of research, so we knew where we could finger joint oak, which there were very few back in 98. There were very few finger presses in the UK because we did very little glulam, so there wasn't much
Yeah.
need for that type of machine. So, um, and we really understood the challenges. We'd really taken the time and the effort and the imagination, I think, actually, to understand the project. We knew this was difficult.
Yeah.
And I remember Michael Dixon, the then MD of Bura Happel, saying to me rather wryly over a beer at lunch, um, you know, Andrew, if this doesn't work, it's curtains for all of us. And I mean, he was joking, of course, but you know, he was making the point that you know the risks of this project were considerable, and there were. And I
Mm.
mean, you know, you talking of sleepless nights. Oh yes, I had a few. Um,
Yeah, you must have done because this is you had never done anything like this before. So it was completely a new thing for you and your team.
yeah, yeah.
And so for those listeners and viewers, if you go onto the Wealden Downland Museum, just Google Gridshell, you'll know what we're talking about. But it's this incredible structure. And Andrew, what are the ribs? What wood did you use, and what glue did you use for the rib? Or is that what you call them, or the rafters? What do you call all of the sections?
We call them the laths.
Ah,
Um,
okay,
laths, yeah.
the laths.
So
Okay.
we used fresh sawn oak.
Oh, green.
Yeah,
Oh, green
yeah,
oak.
yeah.
Okay.
Uh, we've done a few tests at Bath University. So we determined that using the right adhesive, and there was a manufacturer called Colano who made a polyurethane adhesive, which was moisture curing. And
Mm.
it meant that if the timber was damp but not saturated, it jointed really well, and you got a very good glue bond. And we sent away quite a large sample of laths to Bath University, which of course is the university that right next door to Bura Happel um, offices in Bath, and they broke them all, and we were able to validate the strength of the joint. Um, and we required, I think, about 55 to 60% section strength in each joint, and we were able to achieve that. We used fresh sawn or green because we had the suppleness, and there was a concern about the rigidity of the structure overall. Because remember, we formed the grid at high level and then struck out the scaffold, used the scaffold as a giant armature to achieve the final form. And we were planning on having all these come-alongs and you know lorry straps for pulling the structure in. As it happened, we needn't have worried. It was much more pliable and flexible. And because the shaping process took place over 2, 3 weeks, the timber would bend and then relax, bend and then relax. It's a little bit like bending a stick across your knee. You can
Mm.
bend it so far, and if you hold it, it relaxes, and then you can bend it a bit more before it breaks. Yes, and so um, we were able to play a significant role in developing the technology behind the way you form grid shells, and so that when the Crown Estates wanted to do Savill Gardens, which of course is twice the length and a goodish half, double the width, we were already reasonably confident that we could do that grid shell structure. And I remember the architect, Glenn Howells, came to the Downland Museum with a number of the Crown Estates officers, including Philip Everett, who was the deputy head ranger of Windsor Great Park, the Duke of Edinburgh being the head ranger. And they looked at the Downland Gridshell, and within half an hour, I was absolutely convinced we'd got that job, or that we would be engaged, at least in the early stages, and that if we played our cards right, we would be doing that structure for them. And I said to Glenn, as we walked out of the Gridshell, we had a private moment, and I said, "You've got the job, now the difficult bit starts. We've got to build this thing." Because this, from an engineering point of view, was actually much more difficult than the Downland Gridshell. And goodness knows the Downland Gridshell was difficult enough in and of itself. But this was, we were asking timber to do something that was extremely difficult. So we had this shallow arch. The crown of the Gridshell was much more shallow, and therefore the timber was working much harder, rather like my story about the bridge for Ealing Borough Council. And so we had to find ways of making the beams more rigid. And what we did was, the Gridshell for Downland was a 4-layer grid. We did that for the same proposal for the Savill Garden, but we lifted the layers apart and put in much deeper spacer blocks. And that gave more, beam action of the laths working together with these blocks. And it was a great project, another great project to be involved in. And we were enormously grateful for the opportunity to work for a client who could afford that kind of structure, because it was, though the Crown Estates always tried to avoid being seen as being extravagant, it was extravagant. There were easier ways to form that type of roof structure, but nothing as beautiful. So yes, we were, in an extremely privileged position, and it didn't win the Sterling Prize, but it won the I Struck D Gold Award. Wow. And that was better, actually, than the Sterling Prize.
Fantastic. And we were worried with the Downland Gridshell. Obviously, that wood went in green, or it's now dried out a little bit. Now you've laminated it together. Were you concerned that the shape would possibly distort when it's starting to dry?
Yes, we never had that particular concern. But what I was aware of was that grid shells distribute load very uniformly, so the whole of the shell structure works together, and they're not very good when you point load. And because it was a workshop for conservation of historic structures where the public could come and see the work in progress, there was a temptation to use the roof as a means to support heavy beam sections. They did do that. That did happen at some point, and it did cause a localized distortion in the structure.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And I'm very happy to go back and repair it. It's very easy to repair. We should really have done a cloud survey, and therefore we could then compare the building as built with the building as it is now. So at some point, the building will probably be listed, and then or someone else perhaps will end up going back and doing a few essential repairs on it.
Yeah, because now I would imagine it's completely dried out. I mean, what would you say? It's going to be about 12 to 15% moisture content, the wood, if you put a moisture?
No, probably not, because it's an unheated space.
So a
So
bit higher.
bit higher, 18.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible. What a thing to do, though. I mean, but you wouldn't have believed when you first started framing with the two guys, John and Paul,
Fun.
and to imagine that you would then be involved in such a technical and completely different design, you
No.
couldn't ever believe that would have happened.
And the interesting thing about all of this is that when I started out, the bulk of my work was in historic conservation. And I was not aware of the transferability of those skills. If you can do good conservation carpentry, I would suggest there isn't very much else that you can't turn your hand to. So in order to do good conservation carpentry, you have to understand how frames are built. You have to know how to loft and scribe and so on. Because essentially that is the technology you're working with. Every time I work on a historic structure, I discover one thing that surprises me. It's either a little tweak on the carpentry that I find brings joy, or a joint type that's been used in a particular way that is unexpected, or something like that. That whole extraordinary richness of historic timber structures is such a beautiful resource, an incredible resource. I dare say it's a little bit like what you do. There is always something, maybe not on every job, but there's always something that is, brings you a sense of delight. You go, never thought of that before.
Yeah, always. That's what's incredible about it. You never stop learning. And even today I was in a property and I saw something that I hadn't seen before. That's the lovely thing about this, isn't it? When you're always learning with these historic buildings.
Yes,
it's wonderful. Talking about the historic buildings, what knowledge did you have to gain? There's one thing about putting a frame up, because you can sort of copy designs, you can look at books and then you can design a frame from that. But you must have had to spend time, the archaeology of the building, understanding if things have been reclaimed, if the purlines are original, if they're not, if they've been brought in from other houses, and really get an understanding, because without that, it's very difficult to know how to conserve and
yes.
repair. So
yeah, absolutely.
How did you go about? Was that just a natural progress as you went along?
I'm not a hugely academic individual, but I very much enjoyed working with others who it was more their natural forte to research the old maps and historical documents to understand the story of the building. I would do some of that work, but it wasn't my forte. But what I really enjoyed is the teamwork, the coming together of the individuals who bring their individual, their skill sets to the table, and also learning that understanding these buildings is about the historical analysis, of course, but also about really looking at the building. And that was where my art school training was really stood me in good stead, because when I was doing my arts foundation course, it was about drawing and painting, color, form, perspective, light and shade, all of those things. But first and foremost, it was about having that ability to really see what you're looking at and be able to observe and notice things about it. And so I would love spending time inside a building, just walking around it and noticing how, the tie beams were maybe sawn on one face, hewn on three, therefore half sawn. Finding the heart trace matching on a pair of beams across the midstray of a barn. Noticing that the braces were cut and there would be groups that had a similar shape where they were cut through and through from a single large log. All of those sorts of things that actually tell the story of the building, as well as the way the carpenter's marks had been used, the system that the carpenter had brought to bear. If the building had been taken down and put up a second time, whether there was overlay of a second set of carpenter's marks, finding apotropaic marks in the midstray of a barn, not particularly common to see them in agricultural buildings, more common in dwellings, obviously. And there's a whole long list of things that, when you really have knowledge and understanding of these buildings, that you notice about them, that for example, the historian or archaeologist might not necessarily know, because they don't bring that craftsman's understanding to the job.
Yes, yeah.
And so if I err towards one end rather than the other, it would be more to the craftsman's end. But increasingly now, I do consultancy work for my new bosses at Green Oak Carpentry. And I'm very happy to be involved, and I'm learning the ropes of how to date a building, how to look at the historic maps, what sources exist for in various archives for the to look out for the building and so on. So I'm a bit more a historian than I was previously, and also knowing when you need a good archaeologist to look at a building, who to go to, and there's wonderful and highly skilled professionals out there, many of whom we know as mutual friends because through ICOMOS.
Yeah. So on the subject of conservation and restoration of timber frame buildings, what is your opinion on the use of steel for structural purposes? And, one could argue that it's overused in a lot of cases because structural engineers panic and don't want to be sued if the building falls down. So they just put these huge, great big sections in. What's your take? I'd be really interested.
It's a really interesting question, and one doesn't want to give a simplistic answer and say that steel is used by overly cautious engineers, which it is to an extent. But I'm always looking to the really good use of steel in timber. So from the sort of late 18th century onwards, steel was incorporated more into timber structures. And some of it was done really beautifully and in clever and imaginative and beautiful ways. So I don't have the negativity that some carpenters might towards its use. What I don't like is when it's, as you rightly suggested, its use in structures as a adding a safety factor to a building. Where a beam may be capable of spanning, but we're going to put a steel flitch in it just for to be on the safe side. that is poor use of steel. But in a composite truss, it can be really beautiful with a steel tie rod working in tension, doing something that steel does incredibly well. And so for me, it's more about appropriate use rather than simply saying, steel bad, timber good, as from a carpenter's point of view. I will also say that when I'm having the conversation with a client about conserving their timber structure, that steel always enters the conversation at an early point, because if you are working with a client whose budget is limited, steel is a really good intervention. So you can use T-straps, Y-straps, L-straps on traditional timber structures to strengthen the joint that might otherwise require a slip tenon or a face dovetail face patch or something like that. And so if the client has a tight budget, we will use more steel. It's a really good, non-invasive, reversible repair. Conservation officers quite likely will favor the use of steel done well. And so I think that used properly, it is a good solution. And it can also enable repair work to be carried out at a budget that the client might not otherwise be able to afford if we're going towards carpentry repairs, or being more purist, shall I say. Because there's museum quality, the sort of thing we would do for the Wealden Downland Open Air Museum. There's, the next step down, which is good, sensible workaday carpentry solutions. And then there's, leaning more towards steel at the bottom end, where, rather than cutting out the decayed end of a mid-rail where it joins a main post and patching it and forming a new joint, you use a steel strap and a T-strap, and make it of a sufficient size that it really does the work. That's a really good, repair solution.
And am I right in saying that 500-year-old frame isn't moving that much now? So if it was a new frame and you start putting these steel braces in, then you could have a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can make structures too stiff. And in actual fact, I remember, I think it was Chris Wise from Expedition Engineering saying, there should be a tenet of the building code that says remove redundancy. Because if you are over designing, you're putting much more weight into the building. And the more weight you put into the superstructure of a building, the more mass you put in the ground to support that structure. So when you're building in redundancy is expensive. And in fact, there was a very nice motto that Ted Happold had, which was as a structural engineer, which was that we can do for a penny what any fool can do for a pound. And I think that's incredibly useful to have that concept that good engineering is about reduction of the amount of material in a building, not the building in redundancy.
Yeah. Very good point.
And actually, just as an aside, I wanted to say that I am a great admirer of the Bedells Theatre project. It was not one that we worked on. We bid for it, but we didn't win it. Carpenter Oak did it, Charlie Brentwell. And they had an engineer called Ian Duncan, I think his name was, Atelier 10. And he designed these composite steel and timber trusses, which he did with jib and cotters and little, tensioned up jib and cotter tension plates and tie rods and so on. That is a masterclass in the combination of steel and timber, doing what steel does well, beautifully, and doing what timber does well, beautifully, and combining them into something that is, a really truly beautiful and well designed timber structure. If I'm giving a CPD or a lecture on timber structure design, that is always in my one of the exemplars I would use, because it is a fantastic building.
That's really interesting. So overall, your view is very similar to mine, actually. Not to just slap a huge, great big beam up just because you want to actually belt and braces. It's looking at individual repairs and joints and saying, well, look, if we put a 2-inch strap on here, rather than actually cutting away a lot of this original material, that's actually better for the building. Also, it's better for the client because it's not going to be as expensive.
Absolutely.
And then if the client wins the lottery down the line, then maybe, something else can be done. But these people have to live in these buildings.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's just having a sensible approach, and that's good, because there will be purists out there saying, no, you have to do wood with wood, but that's not always the case. So
absolutely. And I remember a conversation with Richard Harris, the then museum director, where a member of the public came up and asked us. We were there was an exhibition we were doing on one of the craft days at the museum, and we had a stand. And I was there, standing there, and a member of the public came up and said, "Now, this is all very well, you doing these beautiful, museum quality repairs, but if you own a listed building and you can't afford to do the repair, how do you? What are your options?" And Richard, without a moment's hesitation, said, "Well, you shouldn't own a listed building if you can't afford it." And I was a bit taken aback, because I thought that was a bit harsh. But actually, there are stopgaps that owners of beautiful historic structures can adopt. And one of them is, it should not be overlooked, is to use traditional lime mortar, soft lime mortar, with chopped hair and maybe a bit of chicken wire or whatever, to fill voids in the oak frame exterior, where it's a panel infilled timber frame, as a stopgap to slow up the decay of the timber structure. So you just pull out the loose material, only what you can remove fairly gently with your hand, and then you put in a bit of chicken wire and you pack it with, NHL 3 or 4 lime mortar with chopped hair, and that will slow up decay for, I don't know, 5 years, maybe more.
Yeah.
And give you a little bit of breathing space. So I think there are solutions, and I think we just need to be a bit more imaginative.
Yeah, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the top tip of the week. I'm loving that, because the mortar will get will take the moisture, but by the time it's penetrated through to, say, the back, hopefully the sun's come out and it's going to draw the moisture back out again, and that moisture wouldn't have got to the decayed area. So it's a great idea, and also it's something you can just pull out with your fingers anyway when you want to do a proper repair.
Absolutely. And of course, not forgetting that you mentioned porosity. The lime mortar, traditional lime mortars, are also naturally insecticidal and fungicidal.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of a win-win, really.
Yeah, I know, it's fantastic. Now, I've got one more question about modern materials before we move on to our final section, and it's another very controversial one, Andrew, and it's resins.
I know what you're going to say. Yeah,
resins and fillers. Where do we start? We need another 2 hours now.
No, I'm afraid you really set a hair running there. I remember I cut my teeth as a conservation carpenter with Roger Champion. Now, Roger was a great advocate of using resins, and there is no doubt in my mind that using resins enables much more retention of historic fabric.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah.
And
I agree.
that there is this, I don't know how it became so prevalent, this idea that resins are bad. Maybe it was because there was a case in a building where a glue joint trapped moisture,
Yeah.
being less porous than the material, the timber itself, and um, and therefore accelerated decay. That can happen, but in the vast majority of cases, in a barn where you're repairing a scarfing and you enter a tie beam and you want to use resin to improve the strength of the capacity of the joint, it's a really good material. And yes, I do use fillers, but nothing like as much as Roger would have advocated. So Roger would, for example, use, fillers and uh, dry oak sawdust and a mixture of resin for repairing rafter foot scotches. So you've got a run of top plate on the bench in front of you, and he would repair the rafter foot scotches using resin. And I would probably balk at that. And he also used resin very extensively on North Cray. North Cray is that rather beautiful elm frame that's red and white at the Wealden Downland Open Air Museum, next to Titchfield and the Market Hall and so on, and the Horsham Shop. And Roger used that quite extensively for patching the face of some of the main posts. Surprisingly, it was pretty good. So that was 24 years thereabouts since he did the repairs. In a frame, fully exposed to the external weather, to the environment, with door infill panels with a lime render. And some of those repairs were still good. Admittedly, not on the south and southwest corner of the building, where you get the brunt of the weather. But I was quite surprised, pleasantly quite surprised. What I didn't like is where the resin was disguised and made to look like wood grain. That really rather offended me. And I have to say that if you're going to use fillers, then let it be known that that's what you've done. And don't try and sort of disguise it. Roger was a master at using, cementone dyes and playing fast and loose with epoxy resin in a way that the instruction manual tells you never should. But yes, I am a much more pro the use of resins than many conservation officers. I'm sure there's something about the way conservation officers seem to perhaps I shouldn't say this, but they tend to move, have a lot of received wisdom, and they tend to form opinions en bloc about resin good, steel good, resin bad, steel good, or whatever. And I'd love to, spend time in a room with makers like ourselves and conservation officers with some slides of projects that we've done and say to them, let's revisit this received wisdom that you don't use resins in historic conservation, timber conservation, and formulate a proper working notion of how resins should be used and where not, because there's a huge loss of expertise within the conservation, within conservation departments in local authorities. caused by cost cutting and a lot of them going into the private sector and so on. And increasingly I have difficult conversations with conservation officers who, for example, will say to me something like, there's got this beautiful Pitthorn elm boarding on the outside of this barn, Andrew, and we want to see it all reused. And I'm looking at the client and I can see their heart sinking into their boots because they're about to spend, upwards of $500,000 on this building to convert it to a residential or something of that sort. And they know that this is the wrong thing to do. And so, I've had conversations with conservation officers about, let's understand which bits of a building are sacrificial and which bits are permanent or structural. So external wattle and door panels, sacrificial. The cottager would have replaced the panel every, 10, 15 years. Roof tiles, you take the roof tiles off a roof and replace them on a 50-year cycle or thereabouts. Weatherboarding is the same. Weatherboarding is another sacrificial element in a building. And if you want to conserve some of it, then remove it and put it somewhere where it's maybe under a protected eave or something like that. But you have to understand, conservation officers have to understand better the building technology in order to be a little bit more porous with their idea, because they wield a lot of authority in historic building conservation, and they need to be a little bit more porous to other ideas. So, for example, another case in point that I would give is that we live in a world with serious climate change happening. It's threatening, the life as we know it is changing. And we haven't quite caught up with what life is going to look like in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time. There's little point, in my view, conserving historic structures if you're not also trying to find a way to be cognizant of the world we're living in and our changing environment. So it's those sorts of conversations that we're not having that need to be had, so that thinkers and makers and people who are spending money on conserving these buildings because they want a beautiful home and a historic structure or whatever are talking to conservation officers and planners and so on and saying there is a bit of middle ground. I mean, everyone needs to listen to the viewpoint of the other and establish perhaps a better way of having these conversations.
While you've been talking, I've been thinking, and I'm sure it doesn't exist, we should set up a new conference where craftspeople and conservation officers and listed buildings officers all congregate and communicate.
Yeah, that would be great, wouldn't it?
Wouldn't it?
If we could develop a high-level seminar.
Yeah, seminar. That's
over the course of 2 to 3 days.
Yes.
Where any conservation officer in their right mind would be silly not to want to be there, because they will be having these kinds of conversations with people who really know what they're talking about, and then you could really make a lot of headway.
Huge amount.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to put that on my list. That's another thing that I'm going to think about.
Yeah.
But it'd be good. That's what's needed, because just going, just touching a tiny bit on the resins and the fillers. Again, it's down to common sense. You do retain a lot of the historic fabric, obviously, rather than cutting it out. The other thing that people don't realize is that, well, maybe somebody who isn't as hands-on as you and I, is that when you have a repair into a rotten piece of wood, you can't just cut that rotten piece out. You've got to go back to hard wood. So you may have to continue so far back unless you use a consolidator, like an epoxy
Yeah,
resin. But
yeah,
then you're using consolidator, which is again a non-permeable. It's a barrier that's going to potentially entrap moisture. So then you have those sort of complications. But what I think is just it's common sense. Don't put some resin and filler in a wall plate with a junction
yeah,
that's going to be north facing, because you're going to be into all sorts of trouble. But if you've got some resin sort of halfway up where that it's going to, the sun's going to dry that particular piece of timber out and the
yeah,
water's going to run off, then that's a completely different decision from the wall plate scenario.
yeah, yeah,
See, so but
absolutely.
a lot of people say don't use resins on all of it. It's all wood repairs, but it's not as simple as that. You've got to look at every single repair on in its own merit, I think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, on the subject of um, sacrificial versus permanent, I've had a conservation officer say to me, "Oh, you can't use new pegs, Andrew. You have to reuse the old pegs." Well,
Yeah, it's crazy.
it's crazy because you know that when you drive a peg through the drawer in a joint, you can drive the peg to the point where um, the peg is actually slightly damaged
Mm,
by the way that the drawer is stressing the peg in the change of direction. Um, and that when that peg comes out, it cannot be put back. If in fact, when we dismantle oak frames, which we do often enough, we drill out the center of the peg with a long series 9mm bit so that beyond the drawer, so that you could then drift the peg out of the joint. Now, the idea that we should be trying to drift out the pegs, with a drift or whatever, in such a way that we can then reuse it, is frankly nonsense.
yeah,
Is that
yeah,
is that sort of disconnect between makers and conservation officers that is creating a problem. For example, again, I've had conservation officers say to me, we must retain these historic external wattle and door panels. And they're so loose, and the hazel, rods within the panel are so decayed that one little push and it would fall out. Um, and you really can't do that. The building has to be, it's a building. It has to be fit for purpose. Um, and so I managed to find ways to barter with them and to say, we will preserve the smoke blackened panels of the hall internally, and ensure that they're properly retained. And we'll find ways to retain the panel and repair the panel edge if need be, if you will allow us to replace those external panels with modern materials that will actually add some insulation value, and they will have a properly weathered junction between the panel and the frame. All sorts of technologies exist that actually are quite highly beneficial to
mm,
historic timber structures. So there's lots of moving parts to this sort of discussion.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming towards the end, Andrew, and this has been so good. And I'm just thinking, I would just be so proud of what you've achieved. It's incredible, and obviously you're going into your next chapter now. But it's
Mm.
what you've done from those early days, the pottery and then the woodwork and the framing, and having the bravery to put your neck on the line. Not many people have that. And
No.
and did you feel that that's just part of who you were, or um, did it feel natural to gamble because it's a
Yeah, it is a
huge,
gamble.
huge gamble?
Well, firstly, it's very kind of you to say those kind things. Um, um, I think that having a strong heart, which is a quality I think that people who like to achieve things in this world need to possess can be a blessing and a curse. I've got myself into all sorts of scrapes by, perhaps not looking twice before jumping. But yes, if you want to achieve anything in this world, you have to have enough self-belief and courage to put yourself in harm's way, if you want to look at it in that way.
Yeah.
But I think there's something else here which I think is really important, and that is that I think sometimes when you have that willingness to step out of your comfort zone, serendipitously things will happen, and that there is always an answer to even some of our most pressing difficulties. So, I can remember a job beginning to go quite badly wrong. And Steve and I it was the Downland Grid Shell, and it was because the factory was not jointing the timber at a high enough temperature. So we needed a minimum of 10 degrees for the adhesive to cure well. And the factory was unheated, and it was winter, January. And we had to go up to the factory, and we had to stop the production because we were taking away small batches of the material, sample batches, as it was coming off the production. And we were testing them. And we had a simple device where we would induce a certain amount of curvature to the lath with a kind of a rig that we designed and built. And they were breaking, and they were breaking too easily. And we realized that this was jeopardizing the whole project. And we said to the guy said, I can't afford to heat this factory. So we said, don't worry, we'll put up a polytunnel over your machine. And that's what we did. We found a way to isolate the problem, and so sometimes, being in a scary situation is also about, having the imagination to figure out how to get around things. And we did generally mostly find a way around. And I think it's that belief that if you're willing to start the difficult job of solving the problem, something will happen out there. It's a little bit like the Star Wars idea, may the force be with you. The force will come somehow if you're willing to start.
Yes,
you set a chain reaction, and the thing can often resolve itself. So there's that as well.
I agree. Time and time again, you're thinking that there's just no way out, and then you're a few weeks down the line, and then you think, oh, that one aspect of this job has changed, and then it's a knock-on effect, and it literally you come out the other side, and that happens time and time and time again. For any of the youngsters that are listening to this, don't be afraid. You have to go out there, and you have to put your neck on the line, as you won't achieve unless you gamble. And
absolutely.
And the more you do, some respects, the easier it becomes because you get used to it. So it's it's fascinating. But so are there any resources, websites, organizations that you could recommend? I know that obviously the Wealden Downland's a fantastic place to learn, but anything else online?
The most useful resource is other people.
Yeah.
And I'm a great advocate of knowing what you don't know is a great thing in life. And not being too proud to say I'm, completely bamboozled and I've no way of knowing how best to get this out of this pickle. is a really good place to start from sometimes. If you're able to start a few conversations with people, and something is again this thing of the way life has of meeting you halfway, and I think that just starting a conversation can be incredibly enlightening. Whether it's who do we know, Jim Coulson, Ed Morton, all sort of friends and colleagues, and things will spin off from that sort of conversation, and in a way that can be quite surprisingly good and helpful.
That's wonderful, Andrew. Well, look, it's been such an honor today. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all your invaluable expertise. It's been such a pleasure to learn from you and hearing all about your amazing career. But before we say goodbye, where can our listeners find out more about you and your current projects?
We do have a website. It's not really very finished yet, but the charity that I'm working on forming, and we're having in a conversation with the Charities Commission to form this new website, and it's a wellness project. It's called Sanctuaries for Humanity, and it's finding the inner sanctuary that we all need to and be able to encounter within ourselves to find our resilience in a world that is changing very quickly and not always in a good way. But we do have a website, but it is very early days. And because it's not the rich resource that it will undoubtedly become.
Yeah, it's early days. It's early days.
It's early days. Yeah. I shall continue doing a little bit of conservation work, and hopefully my current employers will find me useful in doing that. If I can find somewhere with a vegetable garden, I shall also be very happy. Continue to grow my own vegetables, and so there's lots of good things to look forward to in and I'm retraining as a shiatsu practitioner as well. So I'm looking forward to that new chapter opening up. It's interesting, Vincent, just that noting that as you get older, you realize that when you start out in life, you think that you are a potter or a carpenter or as you are conservator or whatever. And then the older you get, the more you realize, this is one of the great things, by the way, about getting old, is that you realize that your talents are much more diverse, and that you have all these other things. I've always been interested in homeopathy and acupuncture, and treated my kids with homeopathy, sometimes with miraculous efficacy. And so, these strands that accompany you through your life suddenly become more significant, and you realize that you are, maybe healing or some or well-being is something else that sits at the heart of who you are. And you've just, slowly been nurturing it, but not really in a particularly conscious way up until a certain point. And you think, that's really what I want to do more of. Life is fascinating.
But unfortunately, Andrew, not everybody thinks like you. It's so refreshing, and it's an inspiration. I think it's incredibly important. The amount of energy and life you still have, you're going to go into your next chapter with the same amount of drive. It's wonderful.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Vincent. It's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation.
No, thanks
I've
ever so
loved it.
much. We will include the website, even though it's at its early stage, and we'll also include the Green Oak Carpentry website as well,
Yes, please. Yeah.
because people can still get in touch with you there. As I say, it's been a pleasure and thoroughly enjoyable. Thank you very much, Andrew, and goodbye for now.
Yep. Thank you
Okay,
so much.
okay,
Bye bye.
bye bye.